Thank you. So our next session, as you know, is on trauma, ethics, and safety for journalists in Asia. I know that is as big of an issue here as anywhere else in the world, and often sometimes more so. We have with us today Amantha Perera. He is the project lead at the Dart Center Asia Pacific. We're very lucky and happy to have him with us today. He's also a doctoral candidate at Central Queensland University in Melbourne. And so he has been studying trauma and journalism for quite some time. As I said at the beginning, but I'll just reiterate, the presentation is going to be recorded. The Q&A session will not be. We want you to feel free to ask any of the really hard questions that often come up in these things. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Amantha.
Thank you. So I'll just talk for about 30 minutes. It's kind of disconcerting to speak looking at myself on the screen, but nevertheless, it's something new for me, but I'll give it a try. So this idea of trauma and journalism, it's kind of been in the vocabulary of journalism for some time, and it's been probably about 30 to 40 years, if longer, that journalists have been looking into the impact of trauma in journalism. And the start of this goes back to covering conflict, covering military issues, and then it kind of moved on to issues like covering natural disasters. But the conversation has now evolved into a state that we know that journalism as a profession is a situation where the practitioners of this profession will encounter traumatic situations often. So there are professions like this, rescue workers, military, security personnel, health workers. These are some professions where traumatic situations are quite frequent. Now, the difference between those professions and journalism is that in the first set of professions that I spoke about, the idea of trauma impact and your mental health is recognized quite strongly, and also in an institutional manner, it's been dealt with. But in terms of journalism, it has taken some time. So it's now only that we are recognizing the impact of trauma on the practitioners of journalism, and then by extension, their personal lives as well. So I'll try to talk about what happened in the last 2 to 2.5 years. Now, that is quite important because it shows how quickly this conversation on trauma and journalism accelerated in the last 2 years, from the time the pandemic broke. So what we've seen is that, and most of what I will bring out in this small talk is based on a research that I carried out between 2020 and 2021, looking at the impact of online trauma on journalists across the world. So this period looked at when there were hard lockdowns, when there were seriously strict lockdowns where you couldn't move. For instance, where I live in Melbourne, there were times where we couldn't move beyond 5 kilometers. So the research period started when lockdowns came into effect, and then when they became really strict. And towards the end of the research period, we saw a gradual easing of the lockdowns. Not a complete lifting of the lockdown, but there was a gradual easing of the lockdowns. Now, one of the main behavioral changes that we came across was that online usage by journalists for their work increased exponentially during that time. Now, using online tools for journalism is nothing new. This has been happening for the last 2.5 decades or so. But what we saw during the lockdowns is that this pivot became faster and acuter. So the amount of journalists who were using online tools to report, to disseminate, and to engage with the audience rose quite rapidly. The other thing is that parallel to the rise in the proportion of journalists who are using online tools as their main reporting tools, is that we saw the amount of time the journalists were spending online for their reporting also increase. Like, for example, before the lockdowns came into effect, only about 30% of journalists would say that they spend more than 6 hours online for their work. Now, that number went up close to about 50% during the pandemic and during the lockdowns. And even with the easing of the restrictions, we haven't seen that coming down to pre-lockdown levels. So the indications are that this usage of online resources is likely to remain. Now, with the rise of using online resources more and more for their journalism, we saw the exposure to online threats also increasing. Now, when I say online threats, what comes to your mind? Just throw it at me. What comes to your mind as the most dangerous online threat that you encounter right now?
Death threats.
What did you say?
Death threats.
Death threats, someone said.
That's it. So threats. Okay, threats. Yes. What else?
The release of personal information.
Doxing. Yeah, doxing. And anyone else?
Sexual harassment is also.
Sexual harassment.
Yeah, abuse and harassment are quite high. Now, all these three threats that you spoke about were quite high in online threats that journalists identified before the lockdowns. Now, what we saw during the lockdowns was something quite interesting. What happened was that journalists started looking at the information they were consuming for their work. Now, when you say information that you consume for your work, it includes authentic information, it includes information that's not verified, and also information that is out and out fakes. So this is anything and everything that you will either seek out on your own, that comes to you, or that you come into contact with because of your work. Now, what we saw was that as the lockdowns became stricter, journalists started identifying information that they consumed online as a serious threat to their mental health. We didn't see this before. So one example is that before the lockdowns, journalists identified that about 9% of journalists said that information they consumed online was a threat to them. That number almost went up to about 50%. It was somewhere between 47% during the lockdowns, and it came down to about 38% as the lockdowns were easing. So what we saw was that online, the information that they were consuming was increasingly being identified as an online trauma threat. And together with this, they also said fake information, fake news was also another online threat. So together, right now, they make up about little less than 60% of journalists who say that is the most those two are the most dangerous online trauma threats that they encounter right now. So it's interesting that everything like trolling, abuse, doxing, all that actually comes below that. So that's a very interesting development that we saw during the lockdowns. Any idea why that came about? Any idea suddenly why journalists started looking at information as a danger to their mental health? It's not as if like they weren't looking at information before, right? From the time we started documenting other people's activities, from the time that journalism became something, that is what we've been doing. We're looking at information and we're putting it out. So why suddenly look at it as a threat? Why do you think?
Because they cannot move physically to verify the data. During the lockdown, they cannot move physically to verify the data.
Okay, yes, during the lockdowns we could.
Because it was news.
But,
because it was news that was happening to them as well.
I couldn't hear that. Sorry.
Because it was news that was happening to them as well.
That is the interesting part. Like, think of each one of us during the lockdowns. Okay, we were all restricted to a space that became smaller and smaller. So we all felt as if we were being boxed in. And as journalists, all of us were searching and going after the story about a deadly pandemic. Now, what's the difference of this deadly pandemic and other stories? The difference was that there was no break, that this was across the world, this was fatal, and this could impact all of us. So I could be looking at the information on the pandemic that was happening in Sri Lanka while I was here. But that information had a very direct impact on my life and the lives of those who I was closest to. And that made me hypersensitive to that information. And that hypersensitivity was not for something that was positive. It was towards something that was negative, potentially deadly. So because of that, journalists were increasingly identifying the information that they were consuming as having an impact on their mental health. And the most effective platforms for information exchange. Now, when I say information exchange, this is journalists giving back whatever they gathered. They also gathering information, and audience engagement was online. So because of that, online, the screen became a major threat factor. So that awareness is unlikely to go away. And that awareness is still remains. It still remains not at those levels that we saw during the lockdowns, but at fairly high levels. Now, this kind of awareness on online trauma threats directed coming from information has a direct correlation to what journalists think about their job. So we've had journalists increasingly talking about the value they give to their job being undermined because of this information being played out in the online space. So one example would be, however much you write about the pandemic, there are millions out there who are believing on these conspiracy theories. So what's the point of doing journalism when you can't convince millions of people? That's also one issue. So now, it's all not gloom and doom. There were some very positive developments in journalism communities as well, and especially Asian communities. Now, the conversation on trauma and journalism in Asian context has been a slow start. So if I go back to where I had my formative years in journalism, which was in Sri Lanka, I became a journalist at the height of the war. And as any journalist, I wanted to become a war reporter. I wanted to become a defense reporter. So that's the beat that everyone aspired to be in. Now, during that time, there was very little, possibly zero conversations about the impact of the work that we were doing was having on our mental well-being. I have never had that kind of a conversation with an editor, with a colleague, or anyone else during my time covering the war. There was one incident that is still quite raw to me. I went out, and this was the time when there were suicide bombings and frequent suicide bombings taking place in Colombo, the capital. And there was this one incident where, for better or for worse, I had got to that location pretty soon after the explosion had taken place. And it was quite intense. So I came back to office and I told a very senior colleague of mine, saying that I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can go out and keep looking at these things and coming back and reporting. And the answer I got was, you have to do this. This is your job. You can't get affected. You are supposed to do this. You are a journalist. So the journalism culture, the newsrooms were seeped in this bulletproof mentality and attitude. And because of that, the conversation on trauma and journalism was not encouraged. Even now, in certain newsrooms, that is not encouraged. It's looked upon as a weakness. It's looked upon as indication of someone who is not man or woman enough to be a journalist. So because of that, it was very, very slow. Now, what the lockdowns and the pandemic did was, it kind of undermined this false bravado that was there, so to say. What it did was, because the whole world around us was talking about mental health, how well we were keeping, it seeped into journalism. It seeped into journalism community, and they started talking. And because of that, we saw and we see increasing number of journalism communities now talking about this, now talking about the impact, and more importantly, talking about the impact of trauma and journalism as something that is core to journalism. Now, say about 5 years back, if I were to give this talk, I'm not sure whether I would be invited because the trauma dialogue was very peripheral. It was like something that, yes, we know it's important, we know that it has an impact, but we'll get to it when we have time, when we have spoken about how financially stable our jobs are, how we can deal with breaking news, how we can deal with digitization, all that. Then we will get to trauma and journalism. It never happened, right? But now it's core. It's right, left, and center of the journalism conversation. So it's in turn, it has kind of created this sort of community movement where journalists are talking more about this and talking more about how to gain skills to not only to deal with online trauma threats. I kind of emphasize on digital trauma threats because that is my core area of research, but all trauma-related threats that journalists are facing. So that's quite a change. And the number of workshops, the number of invitations that we get to go out and speak is has increased quite a lot. In Sri Lanka, where even though I was based there for quite some time, the Dart Center was not able to have a fully fledged program because the uptake from the journalism community was not that strong. We are actually going to do one in the next 2 months, which is a good thing. Now, the other thing in this is that we are having this conversation as a journalism community. That is, we are having it among us, among journalists. But in the Asian context, it has still not reached the industry level. So we are talking about it as practitioners of journalism, but the companies, the organizations that run these news outlets or journalism outlets are not still talking about it. Some of them are, but most of them are not. So we have this kind of paradox where colleagues would come to us and say, look, every time we talk to our officers, the only thing they talk about is like, when is the story coming? And this was quite clear during the lockdowns. During the lockdowns, especially those who were talking or those who were working remotely told us that most of the conversations are about when are you delivering the story or how's the story coming. Very little conversations about how are you taking, how are you keeping up, right? How are you feeling okay? So upshot of this was that there were ad hoc communities that were forming within journalists to deal with that. So in Mexico, a colleague of mine started arranging online meetings where journalists would come together and just talk about how easy or difficult it was to work during the lockdowns. And the similar things have happened in contexts in Asia, in India, Pakistan, and somewhat in Sri Lanka. So 2 final points before I stop. The first one is when we are talking about digital trauma, online trauma, the most important thing is boundaries. How do we create boundaries which allow us to mitigate these threats? Now, that's a completely kind of like a different workshop, but the starting point is differentiation between your personal and your professional self. So the simplest thing is like the screen that I use, this is my personal as well as my professional phone. But how do I use it? Do I take it to my bedroom? And when it's in my bedroom, when I'm asleep, do I still get notifications of my work life? Or is my work profiles and personal profiles just collapsed into one platform and everything is coming together in that same platform and there is no distinction? Is my Facebook profile personal and professional? So all these things come into play. That's the most important thing starting off, creating these boundaries. And finally, this actually relates to trauma and journalism as a whole. Trauma is a very, very intimate thing. What is traumatic to me may not be traumatic to anyone else. It depends with who I am, the person I am, my personal circumstances, the life that I've lived so far, my job circumstances, everything. So it's a very, very intimate experience. And there's a concept that we term moral injury. Moral injury is that all of us, every individual has a moral boundary. All of us have a moral boundary within which we feel safe. Whether we are journalists or anyone else, we have that. Moral injury is when that boundary is breached. When that boundary is breached, we feel vulnerable, we feel threatened. So most of the time in journalists, that is what we encounter. It's when the moral boundaries that we have created for ourselves personally, when they are breached, we feel vulnerable. When we don't have the atmosphere to talk about these things, either within our newsrooms or in our journalism communities, that's when we feel overwhelmed. And most of the time, journalists don't talk about this because it's very personal. And they feel that talking about personal issues is an indication of vulnerability. So, as journalists, as news managers, one of the key issues in managing mental health of yourself and of others who are around you is creating that atmosphere where we can have this conversation safely and in an environment where no one feels that they are being judged. So I'll stop there, and I'm willing to take any questions. Thank you.